start this session of the International Development Committee's inquiry into the FCDO's approach to displaced people. We've got two panels today. On our first panel, we have Daphne, Bethan and Gideon, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves in the order that they present in front of us. So Bethan, tell us about you and your organisation, please.
Thanks, great to be here. My name is Bethan Lewis. I'm the head of the humanitarian unit at Plan International UK. So we're part of the Plan family and particularly focused in my role and my team on scaling up support to humanitarian crisis, whether that's new crisis or whether it's existing and long-term crisis. Very current at the moment is the focus on the Myanmar earthquake response. So since last week, have been working with the Plan country office in Myanmar to scale up the support, and it is very relevant here today as well, actually, because we know in Myanmar there's already an existing crisis with 3.5 million people internally displaced and an additional 1.5 million refugees. So very, very busy time in terms of scale up, but feels like a great opportunity to share some examples from Myanmar.
What you've not told us is what Plan is.
Plan International is an international non-government organisation. So we are working across 80 countries in a range of different settings, and our main focus is support to women and girls.
Thank you. Gideon.
Good afternoon, thank you for having me. Gideon Rabinowitz, I'm Director of Policy and Advocacy for BOND. So BOND is the membership and representative body for international NGOs here in the UK. Our role is to support the sector to work collaboratively on key issues of concern to the work that they do, but also to engage them, to support them to engage Parliament, government on key challenges facing the sector and the cause of development more generally. In supporting our members to collaborate, one of our key working groups is our humanitarian working group, and then we also have subgroups that are working on crises such as Israel and the occupied territories, Ukraine, Syria, and we those groups do emerge when key crises happen as well. So we try to be quite responsive to the needs of members. So I hope to provide some insight from the works of those groups.
Daphne.
Hi, my name's Daphne Jayasinghe. I'm Interim Senior Director of Policy and Solutions at the International Rescue Committee. The International Rescue Committee, the IRC, is a humanitarian organisation working on helping people restore health, education, economic well-being and power in conflict and crisis settings, working predominantly with displaced populations. Part of our work is also on resettlement and integration of refugees, both in high refugee hosting countries, very relevant to today's conversation, but also here in the UK and across Europe, and we had been working on that across the US as well. So very pleased to be here today, and really, really keen to sort of highlight some of the very pressing issues for a lot of the people we serve at the moment.
Thank you. And if appropriate, could I ask you specifically, looking at your organisation, the impact of the US cuts and the potential UK cuts on the work that you're doing?
Yes. The impact of the US cuts has been felt almost immediately with the suspension and realistically the termination impacting on a lot of our programmes. We're monitoring the situation regularly as some programmes become reinstated, but the implications of having to scale back on support for those programmes has meant that some of those programmes can't be restored. That has implications for thousands of clients.
So what sort of programmes and what sort of implications?
So we've seen, I can send you certainly more details on that and more specifics, but we have seen implications for our health programming and our education programming and some of the GBV programming as well.
Thank you. John.
So just to quickly mention, BOND has done a survey of its members to understand more about the impacts of the US cuts. Obviously, we're now starting to engage with them on what the implications might be of the cuts coming from the UK. But initially, our work has, in recent weeks, it's been around the US cuts. We had about 50 to 60 organisations come forward with with information about how it's impacting them. So it's actually affecting our sector in ways that actually we didn't quite appreciate when the cuts announcement was made in the US. We did have a session yesterday with a senior stakeholder from the US who was telling us, who's been directly engaging with the US government around this. What they were saying is one of the key concerns around the future of humanitarian program is some of them, the bulk of the money may come back from the USAID humanitarian programs, but agencies are very worried about the conditions that are going to be applied to that assistance. Obviously, humanitarian agencies put a very high value on being politically neutral and being able to help all people in need, and they're very concerned about the conditions that will be placed on new US assistance around the humanitarian sector. So it's a key concern for the future.
Is that nervousness an assumption or because of what they're hearing?
I think so. One of the things the US government has done to recipients of its funding over recent weeks is send out a very lengthy questionnaire asking them all sorts of things about the way they operate, how they're responding to very particular US strategic interests. And I think that is we could share that with you if you would like to see. I think that is a clear indicator of the types of issues they want agencies they support to be proactively responding to and working with the government to address. So whilst it's slightly suppositious given the fact that new contracts haven't been agreed yet, I think given what they're already being asked, it's very likely those types of conditions will appear.
Thank you. And Bethan, could I ask you the same for Plan? Has it had any impact on your work?
Yes, it has. So for our Plan US organisation, there was 13 programmes that received stop work orders, so significant in itself. But what we're really worried about and what we're really feeling is the knock-on impacts of the non-direct fund, but to multilaterals. For example, we work a lot with Education Cannot Wait, and since the aid cuts were announced, we've seen programmes paused in Ethiopia, in Egypt, but also news that any new funding for 2025 and 2026 would be paused. We're also seeing cuts on live programmes through multilaterals. So for UNFPA, for example, we were just starting a programme in Sudan to support gender-based violence interventions for women and girls, so really, really acute needs. And we've seen that programme being cut from 1 million in support of interventions in 3 different states to $300,000 US in just one state. So huge cuts, and that's just one example, and we're seeing it play out across many different fragile contexts.
And what about the UK? We're told that they're looking to cut 500 million and that any sort of contracts that aren't signed and sealed, they're not looking to enter into negotiations over them. Does that impact on any of your organisations?
Yeah, we've seen a couple of impacts already on our development programmes. So to give some specifics, programmes that were about to have contract signs in Nepal have been paused. But also, we're seeing that some humanitarian funding that was earmarked for perhaps Ukraine, even Myanmar, has been paused or not coming through, or programmes that were due to start earlier this year are not happening. So even on the humanitarian priorities, including the statement of Ukraine being a priority, we're not seeing that funding come through yet.
And is your hunch that's paused until the spending review, or is that a euphemism for it's not going to happen?
For some issues it's been explicit, so that this is on pause until the spending review. For others it's a bit of an assumption, to be honest.
Okay. Stressful situation for you to be in, I'm sorry.
Can I follow up on Myanmar, which is it's not the only humanitarian disaster, but it's the most sudden since both of those aid cuts have happened. What has been the impact of the USAID cuts on that? I know that the US response was slower comparatively than usual, but has there been a comparative funding element to it? Has that decreased? And what are you feeling on that?
Can start off. So for USAID, certainly in previous responses, like Ukraine as another example, they would have been one of the earlier funders, and that hasn't come through yet. It is our Plan US colleagues that track that, so I can certainly share more details, but things like the DART team, which was the emergency response team. I think it has been quite slow to respond in comparison.
Thank you. Brian.
Good. Gideon, to you. Bond stated in written evidence that the UK's focus on poverty reduction is falling. How will this affect displacement?
So thank you for your question and for seeing our submission. And we did a brief to parliamentarians that evidence was drawn from. And essentially what we did was we looked at what is the volume and proportion of UK aid going to the least developed countries and low-income countries, and what is going to sectors that are most directly linked to tackling poverty and meeting basic needs. So we looked at humanitarian, we looked at education and health, and we looked at other basic services. And what we saw is across the board, and we also looked at responding to the needs of the most marginalised. So we referenced research done by some of our members around the level and quality of funding going to supporting gender equality programming. And what we saw is that obviously all these areas have been cut since the first aid cuts back in 2021, but in most sectors they've been cut disproportionately. So essentially on the humanitarian side, we've seen UK aid, bilateral aid for humanitarian, more than halved in real terms since 2020. And even last year when the UK aid, even in 2023, when UK aid went up quite significantly, we still saw 20% cuts to bilateral humanitarian programme, which was quite astounding to see, really. It's hard to understand. I think from our perspective, the very first call on the aid budget should be reaching the very most marginalised and vulnerable people around the world, and humanitarian is at the core of that. So we're really concerned about those sectors, those priorities and those countries not being prioritised.
Okay, and so this next one leads on from that, which is how will that affect migratory patterns to Europe and the UK?
That is not a simple question to answer. I think, it's when you look at the context of displacement around the world, which countries are hosting the most migrants and what is happening to funding from the UK, but also the US and others in those contexts, it's hard to imagine it will not impact certainly neighbouring countries, but the knock-on effects for Europe and the rest of the world over time, it's hard to imagine those won't occur. So just to give you some examples, amongst the 10 biggest refugee hosting countries in the world are Bangladesh. There's still a million Rohingya seeking shelter from Myanmar in Bangladesh. In Ethiopia, you have 1 million people from South Sudan and Somalia. Pakistan, there's 1.6 million people from Afghanistan. And in Uganda, you have 1.65 million people from Sudan and DRC. These are countries that have not been identified as protected country programs in the government's newly stated budget and priorities for the aid budget moving forward. So both from the UK but also the US context, these are countries that are dealing with enormous refugee populations. They're doing incredible things to support them, and they are going to have resources restricted very significantly in the coming years. It's hard to imagine that won't impact migratory flows around the world.
Please.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to pick up that point on on poverty and poverty elimination and build on Gideon's points. That the World Bank has estimated that 2/3 of the world's extreme poor will be living in countries affected by fragility, conflict and violence by 2030. So that concentration of extreme poverty is likely to be in those countries affected by fragility and conflict. In our own work, we look at those countries that are most vulnerable to risks of humanitarian disaster and the concentration of humanitarian populations, and that's the 20 countries on our watch list that we launch every year. And 82% of people in humanitarian need are concentrated in those watch list countries, which are conflict affected, and in many instances climate vulnerable. And those countries are host to 77% of forcibly displaced. So your question about the intersection of sort of poverty, conflict and displacement show that there is a concentration of countries that are currently being neglected by aid because they're difficult to deliver in. And so we're very concerned about the implications of aid cuts across US and the UK, and the shrinking window for support, or shrinking volume of support for humanitarian, but also for overall aid, reaching those contexts where there's the greatest risk of displacement and vulnerabilities.
Can I push you, in fact all of you if you want to come in, are there any examples where development money has actually prevented the migration of people, forcing people from their homes? Because one of the arguments that we've been making is by using the ODA budget to deal with the consequences of migration, whatever the reason, it's not as effective as using it to keep people safe and prosperous in their own homes. But can you give examples of projects that either you've been involved with or BOM members have been involved with that actually enable people to stay healthy and prosperous in their homes?
I can come in to say that the drivers of displacement include conflict, extreme poverty, and climate shocks can expose people to risks that forces them to flee, and that intersection of conflict. And I think where development projects support resilience so that people can maintain their livelihoods and continue to thrive, I want to sort of separate out the causal argument that's there, but it will prevent one of the key drivers or defend against the drivers of displacement. And so I think...
Do we know that, or are we assuming that? That's what I mean. Is there an example that we can evidence? I mean, I know it's really difficult to prove a negative,
of course,
basically.
Yeah. That's the question. So, I mean, we can certainly share some more evidence on the drivers of displacement, and so the counter argument is if you address those drivers of displacement,
exactly.
Yeah.
I think.
Sorry.
Where we do have some more concrete project examples is probably more on the climate-induced displacement front. So, for example, in the Philippines, where we've been supporting programs around anticipatory action, so releasing support to communities before the worst of the impact hits. We're hearing stories from those projects that communities, families were able to get support, whether that's access to shelter materials, access to cash, to be able to support, reinforce their own homes and their own needs in their setting without having to be displaced. So it's a slightly different, quite specific example, but I think we can certainly share some more conflict-induced project examples as well.
Well, either, both. I'm thinking Costa Rica, because the local communities there taking control over their coastline to prevent erosion would be a good example compared to what happens if you don't. Noah's trying to get in.
Yeah, you've sort of answered my question in part, but perhaps if we can just dig a bit deeper on how you actually use. Clearly you've got risk and a very good understanding of risk of displacement. I just wonder how much that really informs the sort of patterns of the work that you choose to undertake, and how much data you as organisations can collect behind that. I mean, it may also, appreciate it may just be a sort of theoretical that you have access to case studies and do retrospective work around this, but I'm just wondering if that also informs your work programmes.
You're asking about how data on emerging crises informs where we strategically
around
focus.
that risk of displacement.
Yeah. I mean, just to follow up on a key element of evolving UK support that we think is really quite important, and that was what was announced in the white paper in 2023, which was the Resilience and Adaptation Fund. And I think a number of our members have been quite active in calling for that type of funding to be provided as an anticipatory response to emerging indicators of where crises are becoming apparent or growing, having funding alongside that to support communities to remain resilient and have the best chance of being able to stay in their homes or stay locally. And our members really think the evidence has been there for a long, long time that more proactive support for resilience and supporting communities to deal with crises at an early stage is needed, and that will be fundamental to making the whole system work more effectively.
Thank you. Ryan.
Moving on, but it's kind of related and it all helps to build our case. How will a fall in UK ODA spending on poverty reduction affect the UK's ability to exercise soft power?
So, if I could, I think there's a pretty strong consensus that the cuts that were undertaken in 2021, when we moved from 0.7% of national income to 0.5%, and as for the A budget, that was incredibly damaging of our relationships around the world. I think what has been on the table for up until recently was an opportunity to rebuild those relationships, and I imagine lots of countries have received signals from the government saying we're back on the global stage, we are going to be a reliable, equitable partner, that those relationships were going to be rebuilt, that the UK was going to get back to a situation where those countries could rely on them for support. And what we've seen is we've had to turn around to those countries yet again and tell them that much of that support won't be forthcoming. So it's a double whammy in terms of our relationship with those countries. We've already let them down once. We've told them we're going to rebuild those relationships, and now we're going to let them down again. And we're talking about tens of countries across Africa and other parts of the developing world that were eager to see the UK back on the scene, and will now lose their confidence that we are an actor that is able to partner with them and support them to address their fundamental needs.
Mm-hmm. Can I push you on that point? So I remember before these cuts, these most recent cuts, speaking at this committee and asking, do they trust us? Do countries where we're operating in trust us? And they said, now they do, and they're starting to, pretty much as you've said. So now this second round of cuts have come in. Has that trust completely disappeared?
Well, I wouldn't want to read the minds of leaders across a region I visit all too infrequently, or regions of the world I visit all too infrequently. It's hard to imagine what we could do to sort of lessen their trust even more. I think on the one hand, it's probably a good thing we haven't scaled up and then taken the money away, that it's in some ways the promise of funding. We have actually started to scale up bilateral aid this year. So programs have started going back up, and I think countries will have already started to think very seriously about how they can use that, how it could support their long-term needs, started to bring in capacity to start delivering those programs. So yeah, it's hard to imagine a policy or a set of actions that could harm that trust even more right now.
Alice, do you want to come in now?
Yeah, I suppose one of the things that's been speculated about in terms of the cuts both here in the US is that will open up space for other actors to come in, China, Russia, etc., impacting on our ability elsewhere. And there's been some reporting around, and I know there's regional dynamics around Myanmar and seeing that in action. Have you seen other donors step in to fill the gap that's been left, particularly by the US, in any of the responses that you've been dealing with so far?
Coming briefly. I think that has been the case in Myanmar, and that's certainly what we're hearing from teams on the ground, including very specific examples around access to visas and nationalities being deployed into the response. But for us as an NGO, the types of donors that we're seeing that are starting to fill the gap are also philanthropic organisations, so trusts and foundations, not to the same scale and at the speed required, but yeah, there is some slow movement, that there's a more diverse set of donors, but nowhere near filling the...
Is that aid delivered in different ways from other donors? So the way that China would give aid, for example, in an emergency like Myanmar, does that differ in approach from how the US or UK might have delivered aid in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I can comment on that. You know, one thing that the UK has been very strong on is its flexibility in aid and a commitment to sort of multi-year aid, which is really important for programmes to yield outcomes. Just thinking about, just to sort of relate that to the soft power question, I think you're asking sort of about trust. There's also an important role that the UK has played in multilaterals, in driving the efficiency of multilaterals, and we've talked about the consequences for multilaterals of the cuts, but there are consequences for losing the influence over multilaterals of potentially reducing the contribution. And so thinking specifically about the World Bank, which the UK has really done a lot to champion, the International Development Association Fund, 21st Fund that was replenished last year, done a lot to champion a focus on fragility, conflict and violence that was really welcome, made a contribution to the pledge at the end of last year that was extremely welcome. You know, that all contributes to the power the UK has as a shareholder on the World Bank board as well, and one we'd want to see continue to be used for reform of the World Bank to drive efficiencies and to drive outcomes for populations that would otherwise be left behind. And so that, I would say, is at stake if the impacts of the cuts were to have an impact on the IDA pledge. So we'd really want to see the UK ring fencing and protecting that pledge, and that not being damaged by the cuts.
Over to Alice.
Great, thanks very much. Just turning to the impact on women, girls and children, and Bethan and Daphne, I'll probably come to you. Can you just explain firstly the different challenges that are faced by displaced women and girls? I don't know, Bethan, if you want to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to start off with some examples, we know from reports from Women for Women that 1 in 5 refugee women are likely to face sexual and gender-based violence, and that 9 in 10 of the most fragile contexts have the highest rates of child early and forced marriage. So just to give you a couple of illustrated examples, but looking particularly at girls, we know already in crisis settings they're more likely to drop out of school, they're more likely to take on additional caring responsibilities, have less access to healthcare, might eat last and least. But for adolescent girls, particularly facing conflict where there is displacement, they're at higher risk of gender-based violence. There are also risks of trafficking, which we saw particularly after the Ukraine response, but also within Sudan at the moment, where there are extremely high rates of gender-based violence. But the response is, because data is difficult to disaggregate, and also because of existing inequalities, the nuance and the requirements of the response for those girls, particularly adolescent girls, is often below par.
Daphne, do you want to add?
Yes, and just thanks for that. Just to add to the risks that are facing displaced women and girls, my colleague spoke clearly about the risks of violence, but another factor, it would be on economic marginalisation. And so displacement compounds and adds to the intersection of discrimination that women and girls already experience. It's sort of another factor that compounds the discriminatory effects experienced by women and girls already. And that works to marginalise women in the workplace, in the labour market, in access to essential inputs for agriculture. What we found in our work is if you sort of apply a displacement lens onto indicators, you'll find that displaced women and girls have face greater barriers to access to economic opportunities, but also to safety and justice as well. And so I'd be very happy to send some of that information to sort of clearly explain and evidence how that displacement acts as a compounding factor to gender discrimination.
Thank you. And when the last kind of set of severe cuts were done under the Conservative government, there was quite a lot of data that showed that the impact on women and girls was quite big and immediate. And I suppose just in the context of what we're seeing now and why often, and you touched on it, Bethan, in terms of data, but why do you think often women and girls' rights and their unique situation is overlooked? I mean, do you think it's overlooked by policymakers, and is it a not having the data, not really knowing the problems, or is it a political will issue, or do you think it's something else in terms of why so often women, cuts do seem to fall disproportionately on women and girls? We don't see enough aid directed to them, frontline organisations. Just interested in your perspective on why that seems to happen.
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting work on gender as a primary objective rather than sort of a secondary objective to programming, and ensuring that those programmes are transformative in nature and transforming gender discrimination in communities. And I think those are sometimes neglected in prioritising in that way. And I think that there is a risk that the cuts will have implications, particularly at a time when the UK has done a lot to champion women and girls. We'd want to see that retained and that commitment retained. And that's both in terms of convening power for the UK and leading initiatives like the What Works initiative on generating evidence, but also continuing to prioritise targeting women and girls as well.
Bethan, do you want to add anything?
Definitely. Would totally echo what Daphne has described, but I think what we also see is that existing inequalities, that means that the voices of women and girls are often not there at the forefront in terms of influencing policy and programmes. So alongside ensuring that there is that continued focus from a decision-making responsibility, also looking at how do women and girls inform programmes and how do we consistently focus on gender equality, tackling gender-based violence and raising awareness and our voices around those areas.
Can I just add 20 seconds? So I think it sort of in part depends on what the government ends up prioritising with the resources it has remaining. So, in our mind, when you're implementing cuts, especially those of the nature that are being implemented now, you've got to focus ever more on those that need the support the most, the poorest and most marginalised. But there will be tensions with what the government is looking at to prioritise. UK strategic interest, promoting UK PLC. We hear ministers talking about that. I think that raises concerns about the degree to which the emphasis will remain on the very poorest and most marginalised. That has to be at the heart of everything the government does next with the limited resources it will have available.
Monica.
So we had the testimony from an NGO that was working in Sudan, who said the mistake was that we treated the war in Sudan as a governance crisis, not an atrocity crisis. And it speaks to what you're saying, which is that a huge amount of gender violence and conduct in Sudan, for example, but without the voice of gender conflict coming to the fore. Is there anything you could expand on that?
Take that as a no. If committee want to speak to colleagues and come back,
I'd be happy to come back on that.
Thank you.
And Bethan, just if you could also just speak about the additional challenges that children face when it comes to displacement.
Yeah, absolutely. And 30% of the population is children globally, but 40% are made up of children when we look at displaced populations specifically. So already they are disproportionately impacted and reflected in the figures around displacement. So lots of the challenges that I mentioned around girls in conflict certainly apply to children, but with an additional dimension that under fives significantly impacted by displacement and conflict. We know that children's brains, their development is really at its peak in those early years. So what they learn, absorb in those first years, and if that is conflict, that will stay with them, and their ability to develop socially, emotionally is significantly impacted. And again, issues of their physical safety as well, and their smaller bodies and how they cope with the displacement and the stresses of being on the move or being in low resource settings are really acute.
So question really about localisation. Firstly to you, Bethan, just so what are some of the advantages that you find in working with local organisations when helping displaced people?
Thanks for asking that. Yeah, so perhaps I'll give some examples from current crises that we're supporting. In Sudan, the local actors there, community groups, others are amongst the front line in terms of response. So supporting fellow community members in terms of their needs and expanding up as we look at bigger organisations. Similarly, in Gaza, local civil society and local actors has been at the forefront of providing aid to affected populations. So in terms of how can we support that, and I know that there's been some discussions amongst the UK government around this, but certainly ensuring that there's a more ease of access to sustainable funding for local organisations, and that means reducing some of the administrative hurdles around that. So, for example, due diligence passporting, or making sure that small organisations also have access to sustainable running costs, so that they themselves are able to direct their organisation and have a sustainable future, and also making sure that there's a diversity amongst the local actors that we support. Some will be big organisations, but it's equally important to hear the voice of the smaller women and girls-led organisations.
Thank you. Daphne, building on that really, could you think of any examples where the information that local organisations are able to provide assists with the UK's diplomatic and humanitarian response?
So I think what the advantage that local organisations bring to a humanitarian response is one around agility and access and reach, and importantly trust among the communities that are affected. So a local organisation, also including women-led organisations, refugee-led organisations, will be established in the community, trusted by the community, and understand the needs of that community. In the context of a humanitarian emergency, and this is something that we're seeing in Myanmar, the speed of the response really depends on those established communities established organisations that know the community well and have trust and also may have access to those communities, particularly those communities that are outside the reach or control of the government. And so it does help in improving the speed and agility of humanitarian response, but importantly it helps in increasing the inclusion of humanitarian response, reaching populations that might otherwise be left behind.
I think it's been quite well documented with the Ebola response, both in West Africa almost a decade ago now, more than a decade ago now, but also what's the most recent outbreaks in DRC, that having community engagement, with having people leading the response who the community trusts, who can deal with the community's questions with their complex sort of cultural framing of what's going on, is vital to being able to respond. And if outsiders come in and they don't understand that context, they very easily can lose trust with the local community, and they just don't get the access and collaboration that they need.
Yeah, thank you. I've seen that myself in terms of access beyond where the state can go in work I did before as an MP. But would you say, though, that because these local organisations are essentially being used for that access, does it pose any additional risks to their safety? It's to Bethan first of all, but then anybody else that...
Yes, I think if that is the pure reason that the actor is being engaged, then potentially. But I think the way that we try to look at working with local actors is much more holistic than that, and in a much more trying to develop a strategic partnership and not transfer the risk of operating in an insecure environment to the actor, but really looking at how do we work together and support one another in the first phase of a response in particular.
When a larger international NGO is engaging local actors, who's responsible for their safety? Is it left to their own risk assessments and evaluations, or would you say the INGO plays a more active role in also evaluating that risk?
I think the consideration of the security risks and concerns is part of the sort of complex role, and access negotiations is part of the complex role the humanitarian organisation will play, and considering that in relation to local partners is something that they will also have responsibility for.
May I just first just pick it up on point that Bethan made in her first response. You talked about the need to make sure that there was easier funding available for some of these local organisations. I would presume that they may be on the front line for cuts that we're seeing many countries in the world introduce. Is that your experience, that actually it's often these frontline, really essential organisations that are going to be the first to miss out on funding and support?
Yeah, I mean, those local organisations that might not be set up with reserves, with means of staying afloat in the context of cuts will be particularly at risk.
I think there is a real risk. There has been a strong focus of the sector on trying to take localisation efforts forward, but I think if we're all honest, we've still got a lot of work to do on that front. And I think it depends, if you see where local organisations are in the chain of delivery actors and who controls funding, most local organisations will still have a limited say over those funding decisions. And if the partner NGOs, the partner national NGOs, don't take more active consideration of the needs of those local partners, they may miss out. So that is a real risk that we need to stay focused on as we go through a very challenging period.
I appreciate that, yeah.
And just to add, that is a case that we're seeing play out in Ukraine at the moment, where smaller organisations are missing out on funding or are not able to sustain themselves in the examples provided. But again, it's those diverse actors who are representing the needs of marginalised groups that are often the ones that are actually not able to survive the cuts. But certainly in Ukraine, the diversity of the organisations supported through aid is really taking a hit.
Thank you. You preempted what I was about to ask as my last question, which is just to ask if you see examples of this, would you let us know? Because I think it's really important that this committee and that the government understands the human costs of our decisions.
Yeah.
I met a second-generation Tibetan refugee 2 weeks ago, and I was very struck. His parents are still in a camp, and they're quite happy in the camp. Their whole community moved there. They've maintained those community relationships, and I hadn't thought about whole communities moving. Is that something that you come across often? And is it something that you help the communities to stay together if that's what they want to do?
I don't have specific examples to hand, but certainly can send some through, because there are examples where we work with long-standing communities in almost a more developmental space at this point. So, yeah, happy to share.
Yeah, I think it's sort of reflected by, the reality of protracted displacement. So people move out of a situation of having to just survive, but also move into a situation of having to thrive and having to rebuild their lives, even in a displacement setting, which may go on for years. And so rebuilding their lives in that way and establishing a community, establishing networks. And
this wasn't about establishing a community, this was
right.
about a community moving from one location to being
together.
Forced to another one,
right.
and still maintaining that community cohesion from their original home.
And is that something we factor in to how we programme?
Yeah.
I think it's something that we respond to because of it being a reality of how people make choices, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Also, for Daphne, turning to the role of the World Bank, and with the reforms putting an increased focus on fragility, conflict and violence funding, how can the government work alongside the World Bank better to ensure that we improve the help that the World Bank's able to support displaced people with?
Thank you, yeah. So as I said, the UK has been, is a significant donor to the World Bank, made a significant pledge as part of the International Development Association replenishment last year, but it also has been an important voice in the World Bank reform agenda. So thinking specifically to continue on the theme of localisation, about the flexibility in ways in which the World Bank partners is something the UK has voiced and something the UK should continue to voice. So the World Bank has traditionally worked, and their clients are largely governments, but that has a sort of limiting effect in contexts where there may be sort of a disruption in governments or de facto authorities in control, and the consequences of that are there are communities who aren't being served by World Bank programs. The consequences are that World Bank programs might be disrupted, suspended, or cancelled because they can't continue to fund in the context of a government being absent, apart from through, say, trust funds. So introducing some flexibility in partnerships for the bank will be important to continue to remain engaged in conflict settings, to continue to deliver programs and to ensure that communities can to continue to receive essential services that the bank is very effective in funding. So the UK has now made that pledge. It's important that they continue to stay committed to that pledge, but also as part of the reform agenda, use opportunities like the upcoming refreshment of the fragility, conflict and violence strategy to continue to push for more flexibility of partnerships, to ensure that the IDA 21 policy pushes the boundaries of third-party implementation. That's partnering with non-state actors, with the UN or NGOs, and continue to be an important voice for reform that factors in that concentration of extreme poverty in contexts of fragility, conflict and violence.
And if I can follow up very briefly, I mean, we've discussed, of course, declining soft power in terms of the UK's particularly bilateral commitments, but what you've just mentioned there is also the ability of, I assume, FCDO, correct me if I'm wrong, primarily to influence the discourse and the way that business is done at the World Bank and elsewhere. I mean, do you think that the UK can, in spite of some of these cuts, continue to play that role from FCDO and increasingly steer and provide research and drive the development approach forward?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think yes, the answer is yes. I think, the government has signalled that it will continue to support the World Bank, especially through World Bank IDA. Obviously, the more ambitious its support, the more leverage it has in the organisation. I think a big part of it will depend on what happens to FCDO's human resources. So we've had the development review, and through that review and other discussions FCDO had been having with Treasury, there was a commitment to scale up development capability in the department. An extra 206 staff, I think, were going to be recruited. I imagine that's up in the air given the funding cuts, but FCDO still has an opportunity to protect and rebuild its capability on development in ways that give it an opportunity to continue to influence, to continue to generate evidence, to make international institutions work better. And we really think that needs to be a priority moving forward. So we hope the committee because I know that you've raised questions about this yourself. We hope this is an issue the committee can stay engaged on and make sure that FCDO's development capability continues to improve.
Thank you. Before I come to Tracy, I've been trying to formulate a nice way of saying this. I'm a bit grumpy with you all because what I wanted was for you to come and give us examples of how we could get upstream and keep people safe in their homes. What policy changes needed to happen, what governments could be doing, what early indicators we could be responding to. And your organisations are great, and you're great at dealing with the outcomes when things go wrong. But could I just we want you to inspire us. We want you to give us the evidence that we can go and have exactly those arguments with government over. And I'm not getting that from you. What does this government need to do to keep people safe, secure, prosperous in their homes? Because we all know the length of time once you're displaced is going up and up. It's going in the wrong direction here. And we've got very limited resources around the world and very little interest around the world other than to see people as some threat to society. Tell us.
Well, reversing the aid cuts would help. Just to put that on the record, I think if you...
because that's not the reality that... Gideon, please stop talking. That's not helpful. We are where we are, and there's a lot of things that you can do that require diplomacy, for example, or working with local communities, and I'm not hearing that from you.
Okay, so one of the things I think, there are no simple answers, and I think in a low-resource context, there are fewer simple answers, and I think one of the opportunities...
I'm going to keep on going on this because I am responding. Thank you. We have had a good run where there has been a lot of money. And the president of the World Bank 2 weeks ago said the biggest issue that's going to affect us all globally is illegal migration. And unless we get upstream of that, it's no one wins from this scenario. So we have had a lot of money in the system for a very long time. So don't just tell me it's about the cuts that have come in the last couple of weeks.
I'm not saying it's just about the cuts. I was going to make a point that one of the challenges is where you have skin in the game in a region or a country, you are helping to provide a solution to maintaining people in that region.
For example?
So, for example, in a country like Jordan or in Turkey, the international community has been working very actively with those governments to not only support the immediate humanitarian needs of refugees in those countries, but with the leverage that provides them to be able to engage those governments, to provide them with more rights and opportunities to live, to get citizenship, to work. And unfortunately, if you don't have skin in the game, you're pulling back your resource and your support to those countries. It's very difficult to get the diplomatic leverage, the political leverage to find those solutions. So the reality is it's going to be harder and harder for the UK in countries in which it is pulling back its investments to be able to have those conversations, that dialogue with those governments to help find those longer term solutions.
Can I press on that briefly? Because to some extent what you've said there is it is really important. How do we recognise where we've got skin in the game, leverage, soft power, whatever you want to call it? But what I'm getting is that we can be dramatically more effective in our responses where we recognise where we've got that, rather than just taking a let's approach all scenarios approach. So perhaps if I may be so bold, does that not in fact contradict what we've said about this all being a money issue and this about, this being a dire time for Britain's soft power? Surely picking our battles is what we do now.
It's a very good question, and I think that in a very low resource environment, you face very significant trade-offs, and I think that will be one of the things the government will be thinking through: is do we focus on a smaller number of contexts where we can make the most difference, where we can keep our skin in the game and have leverage, or do we try and respond to as many crises as possible? That's going to be a really difficult question. They're going to have to think through.
I've got Daphne, then Brian, and then I want to come to Tracy, please.
On that point of a fewer resources and a fewer number of countries, if we're talking about keeping people safe in their homes, of preventing forced displacement, currently 77% of forcibly displaced people are in the 20 watch list countries. So attention to those conflict-affected, fragile countries with the reduced aid budget is really important. And so we have to be realistic about the solutions that the government invests in that work in those contexts. They are complex settings where some of the instruments that the government is starting to look at might not work. So really prioritising grants, multi-year finance to those complex settings which represent the countries where there's the highest number of forcibly displaced people. I would really agree with Gideon on the sort of diplomacy that can support inclusion of those people who have been displaced, because what we've talked about a little bit is how discrimination is compounding the effects of existing gender discrimination, discrimination based on other characteristics that marginalise those communities, add to that displacement, and they are further away from economic inclusion, from opportunities. And I'm going to
stop you because we actually did a whole report on this in the last Parliament, and bring Brian in.
I was just going to go to Bethan. Full disclosure, I used to work for Plan once upon a time. But some of the work that you've done in the past has been, I would say, really important stuff, where you've been researching and telling stories which cast a light, which is then understandable by the likes of us, but also the likes of your donors, your individual donors and what have you. And obviously it's a hell of a challenge at the moment with everything that's going on, but I think that role in which NGOs can play telling the narrative is so important.
Thank you. That was a statement, not a question. Tracy.
Thank you, and thank you for your time today. I'm moving along a little bit to transparency and data collection. I'll maybe start with Bethan. The government shares little data about how around displaced people and the support it provides. How do you think it would benefit from tracking these kinds of spends and how we distribute ODA money?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So at the moment, in terms of the data that is tracked and shared publicly, it's quite hard to disaggregate some of the data, both in terms of age, gender, inclusion status, but also how money is actually spent in displaced settings. So having that disaggregation of data that people can engage with and feedback on, influence around would be a fantastic start. Also on small things like development tracker, that it doesn't have that full disaggregation of data on how displaced populations are supported, and with that data and it being published transparently, that really helps the engagement and the influencing piece.
That leads me on to my next question, is around what metrics do you think would be helpful in addition to the ones that you've mentioned?
Location, status of those community members, but certainly even the basics around gender, age would be a great start, because without those we don't have the basics.
Thank you. And on to Gideon, Noah's touched on this point earlier when we were talking about work, and how do you feel if we had better data? How do you think Bond would use that data in terms of prioritising better climate change adaptation and resilience and finance and around the programming towards areas and the people that need that kind of support?
So yeah, absolutely. Data is fundamental to the ability of organisations to be able to target their support at the most needed countries. I think we have seen a step change in the amount of data available for understanding. You know, the sector has focused much more on the climate-related aspects of humanitarian risks, alongside conflict and natural disasters as challenges that drive displacement and humanitarian need. And I think one of the challenges now is, for example, to use climate and related indicators to see those crises appearing before they become extreme, and be able to then support communities at that stage to be able to improve and strengthen their resilience. And I think that is something, as I said before, we're really eager to work with the FCDO on moving forward, be able to have those anticipatory responses, using data, using monitoring, to be able to have those smart, proactive approaches to response.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate all that you do, and I do know it's really difficult out there right now. Thank you for the evidence, but also thank you for committing to come back to us with other things. It's very, very helpful to have your thoughts on. If I can just pause this session and ask the second panel to come in now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
See us. Thank you to our second panel for joining us. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves and the organisations that you're representing. Jessica, could I start with you, please?
Hello, my name is Jessica Hagen-Zanker and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at ODI, and I'm also head of the Migration and Displacement Hub at ODI. So ODI Global is a think tank. We work on global issues. We do research, we do advisory, we do convenings for a more resilient, just and equitable future for all. Migration is a cross-cutting initiative at ODI, so we have different teams looking at climate change, for example, or gender issues or humanitarian issues, who then also look at displacement and migration.
Thank you very much. Hélène?
Hi, good afternoon. Hélène.
Good.
I'm Hélène. I'm the head of MAG Europe, Mines Advisory Group. We are a humanitarian development and peace-building non-governmental organization. We work in over 40 countries worldwide to address and limit the causes and consequences of armed conflict. We clear the land of landmines and other unexploded ordnance. We deliver risk education. We do all we can to save lives and prevent and combat illicit as well as illicit small arms like weapons.
Thank you. Louis, could I come to you? Could you introduce yourself and your organisation, please?
Shirley, thank you, and good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation to join you today. My name's Louis Hoffmann. I'm a director at IOM. I've been a staff member here for about 25 years. I've been able in that time to see the organization grow from 63 member states to now 175, with something like 550 field offices around the world in 175 countries. So there's been a tremendous amount of growth here. When I began, the budget was around 250 million. We had 3.8 billion in expenditures last year. Of course, migration has grown as an important topic for the international community here. And as part of that growth and importance, IOM was integrated into the UN system in 2016, and also accompanied the adoption of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration in 2018. Most of my experience with IOM has been in crisis and fragility-related work around stabilization, transition programming, including solutions to internal displacement. IOM maintains a very operational field-based presence around the world, and a good deal of its work and budget is actually committed to work in crisis environments, including with displaced populations. Last year, we reached 31 million beneficiaries with a budget of about $2.5 billion in the crisis portfolio.
Louis, I'm going to pause you there because we're quite tight on time, if I may. And can I ask all of you, we are squeezed on time. What we're looking for is the ideas, the vision, the suggestions, the canaries, so that we can try and present to government how we should be going forward, looking at either internally displaced people, forced displacement, and how to mitigate that and hopefully prevent it. I'm going to hand over to Alice first.
Thank you very much, Jessica. If I can come to you first. The previous government's white paper spoke about the importance of early action to prevent conflict and mass atrocities. Given where we are today with cuts to ODA and the Integrated Security Fund in particular, are you confident that that is still possible? And if so, how are we going to do it?
Yeah, so the drivers of displacement and migration are really complex. There's rarely a single driver that means people leave. Of course, there's the conflict or the violence, but it's often actually the indirect effects, the knock-on effects on services or the inability to find work that then mean people leave. So if aid and if programming becomes more restrictive and even more limited, it means it's less able to actually prevent people from leaving, because it's kind of the whole range of drivers that needs to be targeted in order to really have an impact.
And is there an example you can give us of where, you know, investment from the UK in particular, or action in terms of early action, has had a real impact? Anywhere, yeah.
What works?
Anywhere, like what works when it comes? Because we hear a lot about investing in early action, prevention, but what does it actually mean? If we were going to say to the British taxpayer, this is why we should fund early action, what would you say to?
Yeah, so research we've done found that actually corruption can be a major driver of people wanting to leave, and that was actually very surprising to us. And we found that when corruption is being tackled, people have more hope about having a future in their community. So I'd say that's an example of early action, and that isn't really the most obvious area to target that can potentially have an effect.
Thank you. Hélène, if I can turn to you. If the deconfliction work that has been funded through the Integrated Security Fund is cut, what effect do you think that would have on displacement in terms of neighbouring countries and further afield?
That's a very big question, given MAG only benefited of one project under the Integrated Security Fund. I can maybe only comment on that one.
Maybe speak to that one.
And that, rather than broader on the trend, there is certainly a direct effect of the end of the project that we received in Sri Lanka, where we are now close to completing clearance of all remaining landmines and cluster munitions in Sri Lanka, where there are still 12,000 people internally displaced, although conflicts is dating back years now and very long time. And so this will have an adverse effect on the ability of people to return to these communities, which haven't been cleared today. So there is a direct effect that we can see of people not willing or not being able to safely and willingly return when there is contamination of unexploded ordnance, landmines, or other types of explosive ordnance.
Do you think if those, in that particular example, if those are cleared, are you quite confident that people would return?
We've seen it in many different places. Our most recent evaluation of our programming in Iraq, South Sudan, Lebanon, Guinea-Bissau have demonstrated the impact of clearance of land, where people are able to access safe land and develop social economical opportunities, and as well as the word spreading to people who have been displaced, that used to live in those communities, and now we are seeing them returning. They return because they know it's safe. They return because they have options. They return because they also, what we found was interesting, is some of them expressed that they had trust in local governance and that they had reduced tensions between communities. So we've seen different positive effects of clearing land and the movement of people.
Have you had any kind of intelligence or kind of steer around funding from the ISF or from FCDO more broadly for your projects in the context of these cuts?
So I must first thank the UK government for their extensive support through the Global Mine Action Programme, which we must say is a really great programming in terms of providing predictability and sustainability in funding. We are now currently in the third iteration of it, and we are hoping for a fourth iteration to come. And we are calling on this next iteration not to be affected by the cuts in order to maintain the advancement that we are making in those targeted countries. This program targets specific countries, currently 10 of them. In parallel, we've seen the ISF being useful to address other types of context, and we've heard previously on the needs in fragile and conflict-affected countries, the needs that arise suddenly from a crisis, that for that purpose we also need those other instruments to step in and be able to complement the operations needed in terms of clearing remnants of war, as well as delivering other important side of the work. We often think that mine action is about clearing the land, but it's actually a set of activities. It's not just rendering the land safe. It's about informing people, educating people on the dangerosity of those explosive ordnance, of those remnants lying on the ground, particularly relevant for people on the move that have less awareness of the dangers on where they are going, because they're often leaving familiar areas for unknown areas.
Thank you. And my final question specifically for you is in terms of arms and arms diversion. How important is it to prevent arms stockpile leakage to addressing displacement of people? And are we doing it well at all?
It's another part of the work in addressing preventing armed violence. Well, actually starts at preventing firearms, small arms like weapons, falling into the wrong hands. And this is the start of the work we do with states and governments into ensuring good practice of stockpile management. We often see in many contexts, the most recent where I worked in West Africa, where stockpile are not securely stored and are not securely managed, resulting in very easy access by anyone and leading to diversion of small arms like weapons into civilians and fueling further already context prone to armed violence. Just in West Africa, to give you a figure, the last couple of years have seen a surge of 500% of events of armed violence comparing to before. Fueled by armed violence, by firearms.
Thank you.
So, turning to Jessica, you've been critical of the government's approach to tackling the root causes of displacement. Could you say how you would encourage it to better focus its efforts?
Yeah, I think one reason why I've been critical of a root cause approach is, I think, in terms of time frame, it's unrealistic to expect that tackling the root causes will have a quick effect. And I think that's often how it's communicated as a policy to the general public. Tackling some root causes can actually be effective. So I mentioned corruption before, for example, but also tackling poverty or inadequate services or environmental degradation. They're all very important, development issues to target, and they can eventually also affect migration, but they shouldn't be the primary reason for targeting those interventions. So that's for background. So like I said, some areas can lead to reductions in migration aspirations and also reductions in migration flows. So corruption, we found, was one driver that significantly increased migration aspirations. Also poor livelihood opportunities or lack of access to jobs, we found was also a driver of migration aspirations. So again, if those are tackled, it can potentially lead to a reduction in migration. Having said that, again, they're not easy or quick fixes. They're also very expensive in terms of how much is put into, for example, the cost of a job compared to the number of people that are actually leaving. So that's also one thing to bear in mind.
And why is that? Is it because the determinants of displacement are so multifaceted, or is it simply because in the end it's the people's reasons for being displaced are idiosyncratic? Which of the two is it in your mind?
So it's definitely both. So it's there are many drivers of migration. They interact. Those are key reasons. Then there are also some drivers of migration that just can't be addressed at all. For example, men are more likely to leave than women, or personality traits and things like that. And there was another reason which will hopefully come back to me.
Thank you. Yeah. Very interesting and perhaps fresh perspectives on an issue that's been talked about a lot, but perhaps with a lack of focus. You've also suggested that funding shortages have led us kind of to a back to basics approach, and that's come at the detriment of stabilising resilience, as you've alluded to, resilience and stabilisation funding. So where do you believe that stabilisation funding should be best targeted?
Yeah, sorry, I just remembered my other point on root causes, which I still wanted to share. I think another reason why tackling the root causes isn't necessarily effective immediately is because of the link between development and migration. We find that there's actually, as countries become more developed, as education levels rise, as poverty is reduced, migration actually increases from those contexts. And that is because people have the means to migrate, and they also have the aspirations to do so. So that's also something to keep in mind. It's called an inverted U-curve, that as countries develop, migration initially increases and then starts decreasing when they reach the level of development of, say, the Philippines at the moment. Mexico has already kind of surpassed that level.
And Jessica, is that in terms of internally displaced people or out of country displaced?
Out of country, yeah. That's looking at international movements.
So you see the two different models that play at the same time?
So internal migration is often much more accessible also to poorer people. It's often assumed that it's the poor people that try to leave countries and come to Europe, but they're actually unable to do so because it's very expensive to come so far. So we find that the most vulnerable, the most poorest tend to be displaced within their own countries. Yeah,
that's really interesting. Thank you. And Noah's second point.
Yes, on stabilisation. So of course, tackling the drivers of displacement is so important. So looking at reducing violence, peace building, conflict resolution, those remain important. But we found that what our priorities is to focus on internal displacement, which we were just talking about, which accounts for the largest share of the displaced, also the most vulnerable generally. And they tend to be neglected because they're not, they're within a country, so they're not really a concern or issue or problem for the international community. But it's really important to support those people because most people actually don't want to leave their countries and they want to be able to return home as quickly when they can. So it's really important to support funding efforts for internally displaced, to support access to services for them, and also to ensure they get access to national systems within the country, because we also find that internally displaced may lose access to certain provisions they should, in theory, be entitled to when they're displaced within a country.
Thank you. Monica.
Can I just want to scrutinise what you said a bit more, that when the wages rise, people or development increases, people migrate more. But then it's really important, isn't it, to separate out those who migrate because of humanitarian disaster, who are forcibly, or not forcibly, but moved either within the country or without the country and then come back. And it's quite important to separate those out when we're doing the data on this, otherwise we muddy the picture. Is that right?
So is your question, do we need to separate between those who move internally and those who move internationally?
She's asking about sort of people that economically move versus a humanitarian disaster, an earthquake or famine, for example.
I'm slightly worried that what you just said muddies the narrative slightly, that people want to move for economic reasons rather than some have to move because of humanitarian disasters.
Yes. So at the very extreme end, we can, of course, distinguish between people who just have to leave because there's a very acute or immediate crisis, and then maybe people who spot a job opportunity and therefore move. But there is a big kind of grey area in the middle where motivations are, in fact, very similar. Where also, of course, the migration journeys, pathways are very similar. So it's often quite hard to distinguish, even in areas of conflict and crisis violence. It's often other drivers or the combination of drivers that means people actually leave.
Can I just pause you? Louis, would you have anything to add on this point?
Sure, thanks. I think it may be a more helpful approach to look at forcible displacement and moving for economic opportunity. It's a bit of a splice of what was just being discussed. Those who are forcibly displaced, both IDPs and refugees, are moving involuntarily. There are some that move with more resources. And this, I think, is what Jessica was mentioning. And those people tend to move further and across borders. If you look at Syrians moving into Turkey, many of them were professionals. Many of them have been able to integrate and find jobs. Those who are left behind inside the country are invariably the most vulnerable and have the least resources. But this grouping is still distinct from those who leave a country or a territory in search of better economic opportunity. That's a different set of decision making.
Thank you.
Really interesting.
It's very interesting, and obviously we're interested in it from a UK perspective, where a lot of this just gets bandied up into one thing. So actually, I think it's really important that we separate out, as you have done.
I agree. Tracy, over to you.
Thank you. So what I wanted to look at, if I could come to you first, would to be look at the needs of displaced people in national economies. So in your experience, do displaced people fare better in camps or when integrated into local societies? Mm-hmm. To Louis first, sorry, thanks.
No, thanks for that. It's a mixed picture. I couldn't give you a clear example. I can tell you that in the Central African Republic, Centrafrique, the World Bank did a poverty assessment in which, at some of our urging, they did a very focused piece on internal displacement. They found that some individuals on the poverty scale did better with services in camps, child education, for example. But across the board, you're talking about a group that is more economically disempowered and, in general, more impoverished. The second thing I would mention on this is just the way that the community and also displaced populations are moving away from camps these days. There are certain benefits that have come out over decades of work in camps. Of course, the accessibility of those things. But we see that in more displacement situations, people integrating into local communities where they can reestablish social networks, economic networks, and provided there's enough capacity to absorb them with services and other things, is a much better mid to long-term outcome for displacement. So that's out of camps, offering some better benefits.
Thank you. Jessica, could I ask, what are the benefits of allowing displaced people to contribute to host countries' societies through working? Mm-hmm.
Before coming on to that, I'd just like to add to Louis' point earlier in out of camps. Yeah. So I think it's really important to bear in mind that most displacement is unfortunately protracted. So we need to think about what allows people to actually make a future in the interim before they return home. part of that is work, which I'll get to, but also, generally being able to make a life for themselves, to integrate in communities, to send their children to school, to basically make a better life for themselves. And that's also what I was trying to say earlier on about that kind of grey area in the middle, that often motivations and decision-making processes are the same for all groups of people. Everyone just wants to make a better life for themselves and their families, so that's where they overlap. So there is always, or most of the time, a preference for work and to not receive aid, but to actually really get out there into the job market. It's much more dignified for people. In our research, when we ask people, what would you like to do? Where would you like to live? They generally say out of camp, being able to work. Of course, there is always the concern that it can affect host communities negatively, that they would compete for jobs. It's similar to concerns that people also have in the UK about migrants coming in. And in general, broadly speaking, research found that on a country level, if you look at countries as a whole, there are maybe positive or no effects from including migrants or refugees in the labour market. What we do find is that when looking at specific groups, at small subgroups, you do find effects sometimes that their wages might be lowered, or there may be effects on their unemployment, but that's specifically for just a small subset of groups, and when you aggregate that at the country level, you actually don't find an effect.
That small subset, if you're one of them, that's quite
exactly
a big deal.
Exactly.
And so who would these small subset be? Presumably the people that are at the bottom of the market.
Exactly. So it tends to be lower income groups who are impacted the most, whereas it's generally higher income groups that tend to benefit the most from migration.
Isn't that always the way?
Yes. Yeah. But having said that, so we've also looked at, for example, does including refugees and other displaced populations in national systems or in employment, does that lead to tensions? How does it affect social cohesion? And in general, we actually found very few negative effects. Even when, for example, displaced populations were receiving higher support, we found that amongst host communities, there was generally understanding that this also has potential positive knock-on effects for them. They could see that it means refugees can go out and spend money in their shops, etc. But they also perceived this as fair.
Thank you. And Louis, in your experience, how do you feel that host countries warm to this idea of displaced people working in the countries?
It's a very mixed picture. You're speaking of really refugee hosting countries. The vast majority of them are developing themselves. They have responsibilities, political commitments to their own population for jobs and livelihoods. So I think that at the end of the day, that may be the bottom line. There are many countries that have adopted flexible approaches to this. I think generally speaking, and I appreciate Jessica's comments on this, the benefits are positive to integrating refugees in local labor markets. There are new skills that refugees and migrants bring. Those people, when they go home, bring new skills back home for reconstruction processes and others. And so that's a long-term kind of benefit. But, generally, UNDP has a figure of $21 billion in economic costs per year caused by displacement, internal displacement specifically. That's 76 million people at last count. So there's a cost to this displacement to broad economies. And I think the more that we can integrate displaced people in these economies, the better off things are generally.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Louis, I wonder, could you tell me that stat again? 21 billion cost to broader economies, did you say, or trillion?
A global billion with a B.
And
21 billion per year in economic costs.
Okay, that's
it's a UNDP figure, and it's been used by the Asia Development Bank as well. I'm happy to share the reference with you.
That would be really helpful, thank you. And I wonder if we could move that on a little bit. Do you see a role of the private sector in responding to displacement?
Absolutely. It's tremendous. There are two sides in my experience, and sorry, this is perhaps limited in that way. There's philanthropy, which comes from the private sector, and that's critical. It's a critical component, particularly to humanitarian assistance. When we're talking about some of these sort of structural impacts, if you're talking about internal displacement, damaged infrastructure, destroyed communities, and so forth, this is about the private sector coming in and investing. That can be about government policy structures, de-risking, insurance, things that the IFC does now and could probably do at greater scale to enhance private sector investment. But, we're not, if you look across 76 million IDPs in the world, the unemployment is staggering. And so to address this at scale, we've got no UN agency, no aid program is going to beat that. It really is about having the private sector step in with investment and with some security to create these jobs.
Have you got
Very important.
Sorry, have you got examples of where that's worked?
No, unfortunately, I haven't gotten, we haven't rung the bell, so to speak, on that, I think, anywhere. But I do know that in Somalia, which is a place we've done a lot of work on the solutions portfolio with the government, and where they have a very active diaspora, by the way, investing in that community, there's a lot of potential for the private sector, and there's some interest. So Somalia is perhaps a case in point to watch. And my colleagues may have some examples as well.
Thank you. If you do within your, well, particularly you, Jessica, that you could write in, that would be great. I've got Noah, and then I've got Alice.
Sorry, just a quick clarification, Louis. So you mentioned this figure of 21 billion globally, which first struck me as perhaps a little bit low, but is that the total cost of hosting, did you say, internally displaced people? And if so, is that like for like with the figures that we've become used to for in-donor refugee costs in the UK of 3 to 5 billion? I think it's been in the range of the past couple of years.
No, I think just to clarify, the 21 billion, I think, is strictly opportunity cost around displacement, around people being out of the job market, out of the economies.
Understood.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly, I thought one partnership I'd come across was the Temp partnership that Chobani, the yogurt company, had kind of pioneered, and anyway, it just struck me that sometimes it seems to be dependent on one individual kind of stepping up and galvanising something rather than maybe state actors and the UN system. I just wondered if that's a fair takeaway. But my main question was just in terms of the working. Have you found that anyway, and this is something we'd heard somewhere else, that people actually just end up working in the black economy, for want of a better word? Is that your experience? Does your research show that if there's not formal employment, that it's informal anyway and there's less benefits? Jessica?
Yes, that is very common, and many of the economies where large numbers of displaced populations have very high shares of informal employment anyway, so that isn't necessarily that unusual. There are ways of incentivizing refugees being included in the formal economy. So the Jordan Compact from, was that 2018, I think, is an example of where the Jordanian government was incentivized with ODA to open access in the formal sector to refugees in certain sectors, and also allow their inclusion in actually the social security system, so to ensure they actually get the work protections and future protections they need.
Thank you. Monica?
Sorry, just coming to that point, that ODA from which country? Or was that which donor country?
It was a number of, so the UK was a major donor, was a number of bilateral, multilateral donors, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. My question actually was about, to pick up on your point, Louis, about the diaspora and the role that they play back in the country of origin in order to increase that private sector investment.
Right. The diaspora inputs, the remittance flows. There are places like in Indonesia where the remittance flows are, I think it's 1.5% of the entire economy come through remittance flows from overseas legal workers. In contexts, unstable, fragile contexts, my experience is that the diaspora have a higher risk tolerance. They have private networks for funneling cash and investments, and they tend to be, very effective. Bringing this kind of thing to scale is more difficult, but we do have Ethiopia is a good example, Somalia is a good example of significant remittance flows, and this helps for sure meeting basic household needs for many families, and in some instances it does more for them in terms of generating potential livelihood opportunities or entrepreneurial undertakings. So driving this to scale and looking at larger problems around health services and housing and more structural issues, I think is the big challenge with that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brian.
Jessica, to you. How could better monitoring and transparency assist local organisations in supporting displaced people?
Better monitoring and transparency.
Yes.
So what I would have said is that so what local organizations need in order to better support displaced populations is actually more share of the funding. So we found that they are very crucial to supporting displaced populations. That actually already came up in the first panel a bit, that they provide the services when no one else is there, that they do this in quite an accountable way because they're very close to the people they're providing the services to, so they're being held accountable and they're seen as much more legitimate, and therefore their work can be quite impactful. We found that they often have the knowledge on how to provide the services they need, but what they really lack is the funding. So work we've done showed that refugee-led organizations get 10% of the funding of local and domestic NGOs, who already get a lot less funding than, let's say, international NGOs. And then also looking at this as a share of the total refugee response plans, they get less than 0.5%. So they get a very tiny fraction of funding, even though their work is really impactful. What also often happens is that the funding they get go through intermediaries who then get a cut as well. Of course, working with smaller refugee-led organizations, there can be some drawbacks. It means that there needs to be much greater capacity at the donor side to distribute small amounts of funding, and then also work out more cost effective for the refugee-led organizations, less bureaucratic ways of dispersing those funds, because they're just often much less able to actually fulfill the bureaucratic requirements they're supposed to meet in order to get the funding.
Okay, and does this help prevent people slipping, if you like, into the black economy, into other things that perhaps shouldn't be involved with?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that people slipping into the black economy is always problematic. Like I said, in the major refugee hosting countries have very high shares of informal employment, and that's how these economies work. And then if refugees also work in the informal economy, that's not necessarily a major issue. I think what refugee-led organizations are able to do is support the most needy people because they are much closer to displaced populations, so they're able to target much more effectively.
Okay, and the final question is do local organisations have the funding and know-how to undertake this kind of data collection?
You mean monitoring?
Yes.
So I would say they probably have neither. So I think definitely not the funding because they're already very underfunded. And also in terms of know-how, we found that because they're often very small organizations, they just don't have the management capacity to fulfill specific grant requirements. And then I would say they would probably also then struggle with meeting monitoring requirements.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
No, you wanted to come back in?
Just to come back in before we sort of completely move on from the sort of economics of displacement, which we've discussed in quite some detail. Lewis, so you mentioned this 21 billion figure, which I'm sorry, I'm going to fixate on that a little bit.
I'm the same.
If that is truly the cost, and that's spread across, say, 70 million people, $300 a head or thereabouts, I'm just getting at it. As much as we talk that addressing root causes is not necessarily good value for money, clearly addressing this issue writ large is extremely good value for money, because that opportunity cost that you've mentioned is massive. So I guess my question on the back of that is, firstly, do you agree with that analysis? And secondly, when thinking about addressing either root causes, which can be very kind of superfluous, or direct action to support displaced people, either into work, the economy, or to return to their homes safely, how do you identify the optimal point at which to make what seems to me to be an intervention which is value for money in a way which so much of else that we talk about in this committee pales into comparison?
Can I say both as a short answer? I would like to say, and I think I've missed maybe some of this conversation, but we found stabilization programming, for example, that addresses root causes. And as Jessica outlined, there's a number of these, and some are more addressable than others. But we have a significant community stabilization portfolio. It's designed to keep people in place. It's designed to absorb people when they return through services, through better governance. These are critical investments for a few reasons. The activities that they target are critical for some sort of medium to long-term stability, but also between the delivery of humanitarian assistance and the longer-term planning arc and the data requirements for a development system approach, planned for in a 5-year envelope, for example. There's a tremendous, what we call the missing middle. And it's a really important space for investing in local governance, investing in local service delivery. And some of these things that have, through conflicts, through climate pressures, through other things, have pushed people on to move. So I think the trick with these programs, if I may, is that they're very hard to measure. And we do a lot of work trying to measure what those community impacts are. If we can get a local government to convene community members from different ethnic groups, for example, the win is not putting the roof on the school building. The win is that we got a governance system working again in a potentially conflict-affected area. So these things tend to be very hard to measure. On livelihoods, for sure, you may see more of a one-on-one return for this in supporting livelihoods. And that's about the economic piece. Sorry, I don't want to take too long.
No, Louis, that's really interesting. And on the stabilisation programme, particularly focusing on your missing middle work, is any of that missing because of likely UK cuts or US cuts? do nations recognise the value of funding that? Because I'd imagine it's not that expensive rather than doing nothing.
Yes, I think that's an accurate measure against doing nothing. The US in particular was a large supporter of this programming. We have a good partnership right now with the UK and Germany, who are also doing more and more investment in this area. There's a particular flexibility that needs to accompany these kinds of funds, and there's a high risk tolerance that accompanies these funds. And the way that we design the programs is around these sort of issues. They're run in small grant increments, for example, so that if something doesn't work, it's not a tremendous financial loss. So there are different methodologies to these programs, and I would say overall there's a very limited donor group. We probably have 4 or 5 very committed donors in this portfolio, including the UK over years, but cuts will hurt.
Okay. We'd be really interested if you've got any more information that you could share with us on that, please. And then for the final question, over to Sam.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about the international legal framework, and particularly to you, Hélène, and also we're looking for solutions. So anything that you think we should be promoting.
Well, we are living in challenging times for international framework, as I'm sure you know. I mean, on this, we are calling for unchattering position. The UK has been championing, for example, the Anti-Personnel Mine-Bind Convention and the Convention on Cluster Munition. Those treaties have been founded in the principles of human security, preserving lives. And actually, my colleague pointed out that in the preambles of those, refugees and displaced people are mentioned as being, beneficiaries of those framework. So standing strong for those framework where decades of work and studies have led to those framework, banning indiscriminate weapons which are causing harm to civilians. So it's more about what are we standing for in terms of international humanitarian law, international human rights law. If we start withdrawing from certain treaties that are founded in those principles, these are eroding those very first principles in the first place. So Anti-Personnel Mine-Bind Convention bans landmines, anti-personnel landmines, which by nature are indiscriminate and scattered in very vast plot of soil and just kill or maimed, inflict life-changing injuries. So what the UK can do is really continue to remain and advocate for universalization of those treaties and working with other countries to, even if they haven't joined those treaties, continue to work towards those in terms of the principles. Not only those treaties and conventions have obligations of clearance, they've led to destruction of stockpiles. They've led to those indiscriminate weapons hopefully one day to disappear and not exist anymore in terms of existing weaponry. Just to give you an example in terms of numbers, we've managed since the signature of the APMBC, Anti-Personnel Mine-Bind Convention, to reduce casualties per year in 1999, 25,000 per year, to 6,000 in 2024. This is what we achieved when we have framework established. And it's not every country that have signed up to it. They're not all member states around the world. But the fact that the community of states joined those, they influence other states, other existing states, and they impose the bad reputation for it, and so there is less likely use for those in the future. So contributing, advocating universalization, the principles, and assistance. So as part of those framework, there is the obligation of assistance, and it's where leveraging funding to continue meeting those objectives of
What are the obligations of assistance?
The obligation of assistance is the article that encourages member states to the party, state party to the convention to provide assistance to the level of capacity to other member states, state parties. Sorry.
Does that include the clearance of landmines, or is that?
It includes assistance to the clearance. It includes assistance to the destruction of stockpiles. It includes assistance to the management of programming of mine action. It's not only about being able to clear the mine today, it's about installing the systems that will be able to deal with it. It's a very important part of the work we do. It's not only clearing now and doing it for a certain state, it's working alongside authorities for them to be able to manage it. So it's providing training, EOD training, explosive ordnance disposal training to local people for them to lead the response, and training on the standards to ensure, to guarantee that the process of land release is conducted in a manner that is trusted, that when we say the land is safe, the land is actually safe.
May I just ask you one more question?
I'm going to have to end there. Is it absolutely burning? Go on then. Hélène, could you answer really briefly, please?
Obviously, a lot of the people who work for you on the ground are former soldiers, part of DDR programmes. It's rumoured that thousands of them have been put on notice due to cuts. Is that correct, and what's the impact of that?
In short, it's correct. Due to the funding cuts, there are people being made redundant, and we are doing everything we can to leverage and minimise as much as possible, particularly in attaining our objectives.
I really, really hope that you succeed. Hélène, Jessica, Louis, thank you so much for the evidence that you've given us today. It's really helped us with our inquiry, and I have a feeling we might be pushing back for you on some additional information. Order, this session is now closed.